On September 5th, 1945, at approximately 7:32 p.m., a man walked out of the Soviet embassy in Ottawa, Canada, carrying documents under his shirt that would start the Cold War. His name was Igor Gusenko. He was 26 years old, and hidden beneath his clothing were 109 pages of classified Soviet intelligence files, dead drop communication protocols, and evidence of atomic espionage that would expose at least 39 Canadians working for Moscow. By the time Canadian authorities granted him asylum 48 hours later, his wife and infant daughter would have been rejected by every government office in Ottawa. Soviet officials would have attempted to break into his apartment, and the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union would be shattered as North America discovered that their ally had been stealing secrets throughout the war. The Guzenkos had arrived in Ottawa in June 1943, a young couple on their first overseas assignment for Soviet military intelligence. Igor Sergeyevich Guzenko was born on January 26, 1919, in the village of Rogachevo near Moscow. He had been trained as a cipher clerk at the Moscow Engineering Academy, then recruited into the GRU, the main intelligence directorate of the Soviet military. His specialization was cryptography, the science of encoding and decoding secret communications. During the early years of World War II, he worked in the central apparatus of the GRU in Moscow, where his performance earned him the overseas posting to Canada. The Soviet embassy in Ottawa was located at 285 Charlotte Street, a three-story building that served as the official diplomatic mission of the USSR in Canada. Guzenko worked on the second floor in a secured communications room, accessible only to himself and his superior, Colonel Nikolai Zabotin, the military attaché who officially represented Soviet armed forces interests in Canada, but who actually ran GRU intelligence operations across North America. As the embassy's sole cipher clerk assigned to military intelligence, Guzenko's job was to encode every outgoing message from Zabotin to Moscow and to decode every incoming directive from GRU headquarters. He worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7 when communications volume was heavy. The work was meticulous and required absolute accuracy. A single error in transcription could render an entire message incomprehensible, or, worse, could reveal to enemy cryptanalysts that the code had been compromised. Guzenko and his wife, Svetlana, called Anna by friends, lived in a modest apartment several blocks from the embassy, a situation uncommon for Soviet diplomatic personnel, who typically resided in embassy-controlled housing where their activities could be monitored. The distance gave them a degree of privacy unusual for Soviet citizens abroad. Their daughter was born in Ottawa in 1944, a Canadian citizen by birth. According to neighbors interviewed years later, the Guzenkos seemed like a quiet young family navigating life in a foreign country during wartime, learning English, adapting to Canadian customs, raising their child. What those neighbors did not know, and what Guzenko himself had not fully grasped when he arrived in 1943, was the nature of the intelligence operation he was supporting. As the sole cipher clerk for Colonel Zabotin's operations, Guzenko processed every communication about the spy network, every name, every dead drop location, every piece of stolen intelligence. He knew everything. Colonel Nikolai Zabotin had been building his network since 1942, recruiting Canadians who had access to secrets the Soviet Union wanted. The operation, according to documents Guzenko would later provide to Canadian investigators, had penetrated multiple levels of the Canadian government and scientific establishment. There were at least 20 active agents passing information to Zabotin on a regular basis. Some were government officials with access to classified policy documents. Some were engineers working on military technology. Some were physicists involved in atomic research. Some were military officers with knowledge of Allied defense strategies. And some were mathematicians and code breakers who understood signals intelligence operations. The recruitment methods varied depending on the target. Zabotin was, by multiple accounts, personally charming. He hosted parties at the embassy where vodka flowed freely and conversations remained intentionally casual. He cultivated relationships with Canadian officials, scientists, and military personnel who attended diplomatic functions. He was interested in their work, sympathetic to their frustrations, generous with his time and attention. Some recruits were motivated by ideology, believing that sharing information with the Soviet Union, which was fighting alongside Canada against Nazi Germany, served the cause of international cooperation and peace. Others were told they were simply helping an ally win the war more efficiently. The distinction between legitimate information sharing and espionage was deliberately blurred. By the time these individuals understood they had crossed into illegal territory, they were already compromised, already in possession of materials they should not have taken, already aware that refusing further cooperation might expose what they had already done. What Zabatin's network was stealing, based on the evidence Guzenko processed through his cipher machine, included atomic research from the Montreal Laboratory, where Canadian scientists worked on uranium enrichment and heavy water production as part of the broader Allied atomic bomb project. The network obtained information about radar technology being developed at the National Research Council. It acquired details about RDX explosives, a powerful compound used in military ordnance. It collected intelligence on code-breaking operations and signals interception methods. And it gathered internal government policy documents related to post-war planning, economic strategies, and diplomatic negotiations with the United States and Britain. Canada was, from an intelligence perspective, an ideal target. The country had close relationships with both the United States and Britain, which meant Canadian officials often had access to American and British secrets. Canada's counterintelligence capabilities were limited. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police had minimal experience with foreign espionage operations. Security clearance procedures were informal. Background checks were perfunctory. And the general assumption among Canadian officials was that the Soviet Union, as a wartime ally, posed no espionage threat. The naivety was systematic and exploited thoroughly. The information flowing through Guzenko's cipher machine included atomic research that the United States had specifically asked Canada not to share with anyone, including the Soviets. The betrayal was not just of Canada, but of the entire Western Alliance. What Guzenko observed during his first year in Ottawa, according to his later testimony to Canadian investigators, was a society fundamentally different from the one he had been trained to serve. He saw democratic elections in which citizens openly criticized their government without fear of arrest. He walked into grocery stores where shelves were stocked with food that ordinary people could afford to purchase. He read newspapers that published dissenting opinions alongside official government statements. He attended public gatherings where political debate occurred without surveillance or intimidation. These observations were not dramatic revelations in isolation. They accumulated gradually, small contrasts between what he had known in the Soviet Union and what he was experiencing in Canada. Guzenko had grown up during Stalin's consolidation of power, a period when expressing doubt about party leadership could result in imprisonment or execution. His father had been a minor government clerk who taught his son to keep his head down, to follow instructions precisely, and to never question authority in any context where the conversation might be reported. The training Guzenko received in Moscow reinforced these lessons. Loyalty to the Soviet state was paramount. Curiosity about alternative systems was dangerous, and any exposure to Western ideas required constant vigilance against ideological contamination. He had been briefed extensively before his posting to Canada about the corrupting influence of capitalist society, warned that he would encounter material abundance built on exploitation, and reminded that his duty was to serve Soviet intelligence regardless of what he observed abroad. but living in Ottawa was changing him in ways his superiors had not anticipated. Svetlana noticed it first. She later told investigators that Igor began asking questions about whether they would return to Moscow, about what kind of life their daughter would have in the Soviet Union, about whether the war would end with genuine peace or simply transition into new forms of conflict. The questions were hypothetical initially, careful explorations of possibility rather than statements of intent. But the frequency increased throughout 1944 and into early 1945. Guzenko thought about the messages he was encoding. Every communication from Zabotin to Moscow included intelligence that had been stolen from Canada's allies. Some of the material came from scientists who believed they were sharing research with a fellow Allied nation fighting Nazi Germany. Others came from government officials who thought they were facilitating better coordination between Soviet and Canadian forces. But the reality, which Guzenko understood from the Moscow directives he decoded, was that the information was being analyzed not for immediate wartime application, but for post-war strategic advantage. The Soviet Union was preparing for a future in which the Western Allies would become adversaries. And the intelligence Guzenko was transmitting was helping Moscow prepare for that future conflict. The weight of that knowledge became heavier as the war progressed. Guzenko processed messages about atomic research, information that could accelerate Soviet development of nuclear weapons. He encoded reports about military technology that would give the USSR insights into Western defensive capabilities. He transmitted details about diplomatic negotiations that revealed Allied post-war planning. And he did this while living among Canadians who assumed the Soviet Union was a trusted partner in the war effort. The cognitive dissonance between his official duty and his growing attachment to Canada created what he would later describe as a state of constant internal conflict. By early 1945, Guzenko had been in Ottawa for nearly 2 years. His daughter was learning to speak English and Russian simultaneously. Svetlana had made friends among the other embassy wives, but spent more time with Canadian neighbors, women who invited her to coffee and asked about her family, and treated her as a person rather than as a representative of Soviet ideology. Guzenko himself had conversations with shopkeepers, with bus drivers, with other fathers at the park where he took his daughter on Sunday afternoons. These interactions were superficial by necessity. He could not discuss his real work. He could not express his actual thoughts about the political system he served. But the ordinary human contact, the small exchanges that occurred in a society where people were not constantly watching each other for signs of disloyalty, affected him profoundly. He wondered during sleepless nights while Svetlana and their daughter slept, whether he could continue doing work he increasingly understood to be a betrayal of the country that had given his family safety and opportunity. He wondered whether returning to Moscow would mean living again under the surveillance and suspicion that defined Soviet society. He wondered whether his daughter would grow up in a system where asking questions was dangerous and where speaking freely could destroy a family. And he wondered whether the intelligence work he was doing, work he had once believed served a noble cause, was actually preparing for a conflict that would make the world less safe rather than more secure. The realization that he might have to choose between his duty to the Soviet state and his responsibility to his family came gradually, but by the spring of 1945, according to his later statements, the possibility of defection had moved from abstract consideration to concrete planning. He began paying attention to details he had previously ignored. How closely was he being watched by embassy security officers? Did his superiors suspect his growing doubts? What would happen if he simply refused to return to Moscow when his posting ended? And most critically, what evidence would he need to convince Canadian authorities that his defection was legitimate and that the intelligence he could provide was valuable enough to justify granting asylum to his family. The answers to those questions became urgent in late August 1945. World War II ended on August 15th with Japan's surrender. The wartime alliance that had justified Soviet presence in North America was effectively over. And within days of the war's conclusion, Guzenko noticed changes in the atmosphere at the embassy. Communications from Moscow took on a different tone. Directives emphasized the importance of accelerating intelligence collection before Western governments tightened security protocols. There were references to personnel rotations and reassignments as the GRU adapted to post-war operations. And then, on August 24th, Guzenko decoded a message that included his name. The directive was brief. Guzenko and several other embassy personnel were to be recalled to Moscow for reassignment. No specific reason was provided, which was standard procedure for routine rotations. But the timing, coming immediately after the war's end, suggested something more than routine. Guzenko had processed enough communications about suspected security risks to understand how the system worked. When GRU officers developed doubts about an operative's reliability, the operative was recalled to Moscow for debriefing. Sometimes the debriefing was genuinely benign, a standard review of performance and reassignment to new duties. But sometimes, particularly when the suspected security risk involved ideological doubts or potential defection, the recall was a pretext for arrest and interrogation. Operatives who returned under suspicion often disappeared into the Gulag system or were executed quietly. Guzenko did not know whether his recall fell into the routine category or the dangerous one. But he understood that returning to Moscow under any circumstances meant leaving Canada permanently, which meant raising his daughter in the Soviet Union, which meant living under a system he had come to believe was fundamentally oppressive and dangerous. And if there was even a possibility that his superiors suspected him of ideological wavering, returning to Moscow could be fatal not just to his career, but to his life. The impossible calculation he faced during the final week of August was whether to risk defection or to accept recall. If he defected, he would be committing treason against the Soviet Union, a crime punishable by death. His family in Russia, parents and siblings he had not seen since 1943, would likely face consequences. He would be hunted by Soviet intelligence for the rest of his life, and there was no guarantee that Canadian authorities would even grant him asylum. The Soviet Union was still officially an ally. Diplomatic relations remained cordial, and Canadian officials might decide that accepting a defector was too politically complicated, particularly if the defector's allegations about widespread espionage seemed implausible or exaggerated. But if he returned to Moscow and his superiors did suspect him, the outcome could be arrest, imprisonment, or execution. Svetlana would be left alone with their daughter, possibly facing her own interrogation about whether she had been aware of her husband's ideological doubts. And even if the recall was genuinely routine, returning meant spending the rest of his life serving a system he no longer believed in, encoding messages for intelligence operations he increasingly viewed as immoral. He discussed the situation with Svetlana during the last days of August. According to her later account, she supported defection immediately and without reservation. She had been pregnant with their second child since July. The thought of raising 2 children in the Soviet Union, after experiencing the relative freedom of Canada, was unbearable to her. She told Igor that whatever risks defection entailed were preferable to the certainty of living under Stalin's regime. The decision, once articulated clearly between them, felt inevitable. What remained was determining how to defect in a way that maximized their chances of success. Guzenko understood that simply approaching Canadian authorities and requesting asylum would likely fail. He was an unknown Soviet embassy employee making extraordinary claims about espionage. Without proof, his story would sound like the delusions of someone seeking attention or the fabrication of someone trying to create a diplomatic incident. He needed documentation, physical evidence that would prove the spy network existed and demonstrate that his knowledge was legitimate and valuable. The documents he needed were in the embassy's communications room, the same secure space where he worked every day. As cipher clerk, he had access to files that contained encoded messages, decryption keys, communication protocols, and lists of agents. The challenge was removing those documents from the embassy without being detected. Embassy security procedures required that all classified materials remain in the communications room. Documents could not be taken to other parts of the building without authorization, and under no circumstances could classified files leave the embassy premises. Violating those procedures would be noticed immediately if discovered during a routine security check. Guzenko began his smuggling operation in late August, working methodically to minimize risk while accumulating sufficient evidence. He could not take entire files at once. Instead, he removed a few pages at a time, selecting documents that would be most useful for proving the network's existence. He chose communications that named specific Canadian agents. He took messages that described atomic espionage operations. He selected files that detailed dead drop locations and communication protocols. Each document was small enough to conceal under his clothing when he left work. He wore loose shirts that could hide several folded pages against his body without creating obvious bulges. And he varied his departure times to avoid establishing a pattern that security officers might notice and investigate. The smuggling operation lasted approximately 2 weeks. According to his later testimony, Guzenko removed documents on August 27th, August 30th, September 1st, and September 4th. Each time he left the embassy with stolen files, he walked to his apartment expecting to be stopped at any moment, anticipating that embassy security had discovered the missing documents and identified him as the thief. But no confrontation came. The documents were stored in his apartment, hidden in a location where they would not be found during a routine visit, but could be accessed quickly if he needed to flee suddenly. By September 5, 1945, Guzenko had assembled what he calculated was sufficient evidence to prove the spy network existed. He had 109 documents that collectively identified Soviet agents, described intelligence operations, detailed communication methods, and provided proof of atomic espionage. The files represented months of communications between Zabotin and Moscow, evidence that would allow Canadian counterintelligence to dismantle the entire network if they chose to act on the information. Guzenko had the names of Canadian citizens working for Soviet intelligence. He had descriptions of what information each agent had provided, and he had documentation proving that the espionage had continued even while Canada and the Soviet Union fought as allies against Nazi Germany. He left the embassy on September 5th, knowing he would never return. He walked out carrying the 109 documents hidden under his shirt, aware that he was committing an act that would either save his family or destroy them, depending on whether Canadian authorities chose to believe him and grant asylum. The decision was made. The evidence was in his possession, and the next 48 hours would determine whether his defection succeeded or ended in catastrophe. On the evening of September 5th, after leaving the embassy for the last time, Guzenko went first to the offices of the Ottawa Journal, arriving at approximately 8:15 p.m. The newspaper was located on Bank Street, several blocks from the Parliament buildings. Guzenko carried his infant daughter, while Svetlana, 6 months pregnant, walked beside him. The documents were still hidden under his shirt, creating a slight bulkiness that he tried to conceal by keeping his jacket closed despite the warm September weather. He approached the front desk and asked to speak with an editor about a matter of urgent national security. The receptionist, according to later accounts, thought he seemed agitated and possibly intoxicated. She directed him to wait. The editor, who eventually met with Guzenko, listened for approximately 10 minutes before concluding that the story was either a hoax or the delusion of someone experiencing a mental health crisis. A Soviet embassy employee claiming that Canada was infiltrated by dozens of Russian spies seemed implausible. The war had just ended. The Soviet Union was an ally, and the man making these claims had shown up without an appointment, carrying documents he could not translate on the spot, accompanied by his wife and baby. The editor told Guzenko to return the next day during normal business hours when someone more senior could review his materials properly. Guzenko left the newspaper offices at approximately 9:30 p.m. and returned home with Svetlana and their daughter, the documents still in his possession, no asylum granted, and no protection established. He returned to the Ottawa Journal on the morning of September 6th. This time, he spoke with journalist Elizabeth Fraser, who took him more seriously than the editor had the previous evening. Fraser listened to his account, examined some of the documents through an interpreter Guzenko had brought, and recognized that if the claims were legitimate, they represented a significant intelligence matter. But Fraser was a journalist, not a government official. She advised Guzenko that he needed to approach the Canadian government directly, specifically the Department of Justice or the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. She could not provide asylum. She could not guarantee protection. What she could do was suggest where he should go next. Guzenko went to the Department of Justice building in downtown Ottawa. He arrived at approximately 11 a.m. and asked to speak with the Minister of Justice about a matter involving Soviet espionage. According to the receptionist's later statement, Guzenko was told that the minister was not available and that he should submit his concerns in writing through proper channels. Guzenko explained that he had evidence of active espionage operations and needed to speak with someone immediately. The receptionist consulted with a supervisor, who consulted with someone more senior, and after approximately 2 hours of waiting, Guzenko was informed that no one could see him that day without a scheduled appointment. He should return the following week with a written summary of his allegations. He left the Department of Justice and went to the Ottawa Magistrates Court, thinking perhaps that judicial authorities would take his evidence more seriously than administrative officials had. The court staff listened briefly to his explanation and referred him to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who they said handled matters related to national security and criminal investigations. Guzenko walked to the RCMP headquarters, arriving in the early afternoon. He explained his situation to the officer at the front desk, who consulted with a supervisor, who told Guzenko that matters involving foreign espionage fell under the jurisdiction of the Department of Justice and that he should direct his concerns to government officials rather than to police. The circular referral was complete. Justice had sent him to the RCMP. The RCMP was sending him back to Justice. Throughout September 6th, Guzenko moved between government offices carrying his infant daughter, while Svetlana, increasingly exhausted from hours of walking while 6 months pregnant, tried to maintain her composure. They had not eaten since breakfast. They had nowhere to leave their daughter while conducting this desperate bureaucratic odyssey. And every official they encountered exhibited the same pattern of behavior. Initial skepticism about the plausibility of Guzenko's claims, concern about creating a diplomatic incident with the Soviet Union, which was still officially an ally despite the war's end, and an unwillingness to take responsibility for a decision that might have significant political consequences. The fundamental problem, according to later analysis by Canadian intelligence officials, was that no one wanted to be the person who started an international crisis by granting asylum to a Soviet defector. If Guzenko's allegations were false, whoever accepted his defection would be responsible for damaging relations with Moscow. And if his allegations were true, Accepting his defection would still damage relations with Moscow while creating a massive counterintelligence investigation that would expose embarrassing security failures. Either way, the path of least resistance was to refer Guzenko to someone else, to delay making a decision, to avoid personal responsibility for an outcome that seemed certain to be politically complicated regardless of how it was handled. By the evening of September 6th, Guzenko and his family were back in their apartment with 109 stolen Soviet intelligence documents and no protection. The embassy would notice the missing files. They would identify who had access, and they would come looking. At approximately 11:20 p.m. on September 6th, according to police reports filed later that evening, neighbors in Guzenko's apartment building at 511 Somerset Street heard loud knocking on his door. The knocking continued for several minutes, growing more insistent. Then came the sound of someone attempting to force the door open, metal scraping against the lock mechanism. Mrs. Frances Elliott, who lived in the apartment directly across the hall, looked through her peephole and saw two men in dark suits trying to gain entry to the Guzenko apartment. She called the Ottawa City Police at 11:34 p.m., reporting a possible break-in attempt. Inside the apartment, Guzenko and Svetlana had moved their daughter to the bedroom and were hiding in silence. The 109 documents were spread across their kitchen table, where Guzenko had been organizing them by category in preparation for another attempt to reach government officials the following morning. When the knocking began, he gathered the documents quickly and hid them under the mattress in their bedroom. Svetlana held their daughter, covering the child's mouth gently to prevent any sound that might confirm they were inside. They waited in the dark bedroom while the men outside tried repeatedly to open the door. Ottawa City police officers arrived at 11:47 p.m., approximately 13 minutes after Mrs. Elliott's call. According to the police report, the officers found two men standing outside the Guzenko apartment. The men identified themselves as officials from the Soviet embassy conducting official business. The officers asked what kind of official business required forcing entry into a private residence at nearly midnight. The embassy officials stated that they were attempting to retrieve embassy property that had been taken without authorization. The officers asked whether the Guzenkos had invited them to the apartment. The embassy officials said that was not relevant to their need to retrieve Soviet government property. The confrontation lasted approximately 20 minutes. The Ottawa police officers, according to their report, informed the embassy officials that regardless of their diplomatic status, they could not break into a private residence on Canadian soil without the occupant's permission or a valid warrant. The embassy officials argued that the property inside was Soviet government material and therefore exempt from Canadian jurisdiction. The police officers disagreed and stated that if the embassy officials had a legal complaint about stolen property, they should file it through proper channels. At 12:09 a.m. on September 7th, the Soviet officials left the building. Mrs. Elliott contacted the police again after the embassy officials departed, explaining that she had spoken with Guzenko earlier that day and that he had mentioned trying to reach Canadian authorities about defecting from the Soviet Union. This information was relayed to senior RCMP officials, who contacted Norman Robertson, the Undersecretary of State for External Affairs. Robertson was woken at his home at approximately 1:30 a.m. and briefed on the situation. The decision Robertson faced was identical to the one that every government official had avoided throughout September 6th. Granting asylum to a Soviet defector would create an immediate diplomatic crisis. Prime Minister Mackenzie King, when consulted by telephone, expressed strong reluctance to authorize any action that would damage relations with Moscow. But Robertson argued that the attempted break-in by Soviet officials demonstrated that Guzenko's life was in immediate danger, which created a humanitarian obligation that superseded diplomatic considerations. According to later accounts, Robertson acted on his own authority, stating that he would take responsibility for the decision. At approximately 3:15 a.m. on September 7th, RCMP officers arrived at the Guzenko apartment and informed the family that they were being taken into protective custody. Guzenko, Svetlana, and their daughter were driven to a secure facility outside Ottawa. The 1 and 9 documents were collected and turned over to Canadian intelligence officers for immediate analysis. And for the next 2 years, Guzenko would undergo the most extensive debriefing in Canadian counterintelligence history, reconstructing every detail of the Soviet spy network from memory and documentation. On February 3, 1946, approximately 5 months after Guzenko's defection, American radio commentator Drew Pearson announced during his national broadcast that Canada's Prime Minister had informed President Truman of a gigantic Russian espionage network inside the United States and Canada. Pearson stated that a Soviet agent had surrendered with extensive documentation proving that Moscow had been systematically stealing Allied secrets throughout the war. The broadcast was heard by millions of listeners across North America, and it made continued secrecy about Guzenko's defection impossible. The Canadian government issued a public statement on February 15, 1946, confirming that a Soviet cipher clerk had defected and provided evidence of espionage operations. Prime Minister Mackenzie King announced the establishment of a royal commission to investigate the allegations and determine the extent of Soviet intelligence penetration into Canadian government and scientific institutions. The commission would be led by 2 Supreme Court justices and granted broad authority to compel testimony, examine evidence, and make recommendations for prosecutions. The Royal Commission spent months analyzing the 109 documents Guzenko had provided and corroborating his testimony about the spy network's operations. The evidence was methodical and detailed. Communications between Colonel Zabatin and Moscow identified agents by codename and described what intelligence each had provided. Dead drop locations were specified with precise addresses. Meetings between agents and Soviet handlers were documented with dates and times. And the atomic espionage materials included specific references to research being conducted at the Montreal laboratory, information that matched classified Allied atomic program documents. Based on the Commission's findings, arrests began in February 1946 and continued through the summer. In Canada, 39 individuals were arrested and charged with espionage-related offenses. The arrests included a clerk from the Department of External Affairs who had provided diplomatic cables to Soviet handlers, a captain in the Canadian Army who had supplied information about military operations, a radar engineer from the National Research Council who had delivered technical specifications for Allied radar systems, and Fred Rose, a member of Parliament and the only communist elected to the Canadian House of Commons, who had acted as a recruiter and coordinator for several agents in the network. In Britain, the investigation led to the arrest of Alan Nunn May, a nuclear physicist who had worked at the Montreal laboratory before returning to England. May was convicted in 1946 of passing atomic research to Soviet intelligence and sentenced to 10 years in prison. In the United States, FBI investigations into connections identified by Guzenko's documents eventually contributed to the cases against Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, though the direct linkage took years to establish fully. The trials were conducted with varying levels of public access. Some proceedings involved classified materials and were held partially in camera. Others were fully public, with detailed testimony about how Soviet intelligence had operated on Canadian soil. Convictions were secured in multiple cases. Prison sentences ranged from 2 years to 10 years, depending on the severity of the espionage and the level of cooperation with investigators. The evidence from Guzenko's 109 documents proved decisive in nearly every prosecution. Defense attorneys could not effectively dispute the authenticity of communications between their clients and Soviet handlers. when those communications existed in decoded form, with Guzenko's cipher clerk annotations confirming their origin. For the protection of his family, Igor Guzenko would never again appear in public without covering his face. The threat from Soviet intelligence was permanent. Moscow had declared Guzenko a traitor, which under Soviet law carried a death sentence that could be executed anywhere in the world if an opportunity presented itself. The RCMP assessed the risk as genuine and ongoing. Guzenko and his family were moved to an undisclosed location in rural Ontario, given new identities, and placed under continuous protective custody. The names they had used in Ottawa were abandoned. The apartment on Somerset Street, where they had lived during the defection, was emptied of their belongings, and any record connecting the Guzenko family to their new identities was classified at the highest level of government secrecy. The white hood became Guzenko's public face. When he testified before the Royal Commission in 1946, he wore a white cloth bag over his head with holes cut for his eyes. When he gave interviews, to journalists about Soviet espionage, the hood was required. When he appeared in photographs, the hood concealed his features completely. The image became iconic, a hooded figure representing the anonymous defector whose testimony had exposed Soviet intelligence operations but whose identity had to remain hidden. The hood was practical protection against Soviet agents who might recognize him, but it was also symbolic of the complete erasure of his former existence that defection required. Guzenko became a writer and public speaker in the years following his defection. He published a novel in 1948 called The Fall of a Titan, which drew on his experiences in Soviet society and won the Governor General's Award for fiction. He wrote articles about Soviet intelligence methods for Western publications, always under his assumed name, but identified as the defector who had started the Cold War. He testified, with identity protection, in various investigations related to Soviet espionage throughout the 1950s and 1960s. And he gave speeches, always hooded, at select events where he warned about continued Soviet intelligence operations and advocated for stronger Western counterintelligence programs. He was credited by intelligence historians with awakening North America to the magnitude and danger of Soviet espionage at a critical moment when Western governments were transitioning from wartime alliance with Moscow to Cold War confrontation. The price of this public role was complete social isolation for his entire family. Svetlana raised their children, eventually 4 in total, under names that bore no connection to their heritage. The children grew up knowing their father had done something important, but not understanding the full scope of what his defection meant until they were older. They could not have friends who knew their true background. They moved periodically when RCMP officials determined their location had become too well known. Every aspect of their lives required security approval. Travel outside Canada was prohibited. Contact with anyone from their life before the defection was impossible. And the constant presence of RCMP protection officers, though necessary for their safety, created an atmosphere of permanent surveillance that was psychologically exhausting. Svetlana never saw her family in the Soviet Union again. She had parents and siblings in Russia who were likely questioned by Soviet security services about whether they had known of Igor's plans to defect. According to later accounts, she mourned that separation throughout her life, but never expressed regret about the decision to defect itself. She had supported Igor's choice in September 1945, and she continued supporting it through decades of protective custody. But the cost of that support, measured in lost relationships and constrained freedom, was substantial and permanent. Guzenko lived under RCMP protection for 37 years, from his defection in September 1945 until his death in 1982. He had exposed a spy ring that operated in secrecy, and his reward was to live the rest of his life in secrecy himself. He had given Canadian and American intelligence agencies the proof they needed to wake up to Soviet espionage, and the proof had cost him his identity, his freedom of movement, and any possibility of a normal life for his family. The Guzenko children grew up knowing their father had done something important, but never fully understanding what it had cost him or what it had cost them. They were raised under assumed names in locations that changed periodically for security reasons. They attended schools where they could not explain why RCMP officers sometimes appeared at school events, or why their family never had relatives visit for holidays. They understood that their father was protected because of something he had done before they were born, something involving the Soviet Union and Canadian security, but the specifics remained vague throughout their childhoods. As adults, according to interviews conducted decades later, the children developed complex perspectives on their father's choice. They recognized that the spy ring had threatened national security and that atomic espionage could have accelerated Soviet nuclear weapons development. They understood that their father had prevented classified Allied research from reaching Stalin's government. And they acknowledged that exposing the network had been an act of considerable courage given the personal risks involved. But they also recognized what had been lost: a normal childhood without constant security presence, relationships with extended family in Russia whom they would never meet, the freedom to develop friendships without concealing essential facts about their background, and the ability to live openly without the permanent awareness that their father's past made them potential targets. The children never expressed, in available accounts, anger toward their father for the decision he made in September 1945. But they acknowledged that growing up as the family of a Soviet defector had shaped their lives in ways they spent years processing and understanding. The pride they felt in what he had accomplished existed alongside the loss of what might have been had circumstances been different. Guzenko himself, according to his writings in later years, continued to believe the defection had been necessary. He never regretted exposing the spy ring, but he acknowledged in private moments, according to family accounts, that the burden placed on Svetlana and their children had been substantial. He believed that awakening the West to Soviet espionage had justified the personal costs. But he understood that those costs had been paid not just by him, but by everyone who bore his name, real or assumed. Igor Guzenko died on June 25, 1982, at age 63, still living under the assumed name he had adopted 37 years earlier. The cause of death was a heart attack. He was buried in an undisclosed location under his assumed identity, with only immediate family and RCMP officials present at the funeral. No public announcement of his death was made until several days later, when Canadian officials confirmed that the Soviet defector whose testimony had exposed the spy ring in 1945 had passed away. Even in death, his true identity remained protected. Svetlana survived him by several years, continuing to live under RCMP protection with the assumed name she had carried since September 1945. The children, by then adults with families of their own, maintained the secrecy that had defined their lives. They understood that Soviet intelligence maintained records of traitors indefinitely, and that the threat, though diminished with time, never fully disappeared. In the decades following Guzenko's defection, documents related to the spy ring were gradually declassified. The Royal Commission findings became public. Some of Guzenko's testimony was released with names and sensitive details redacted, and historians gained access to materials that confirmed the scope of Soviet espionage operations in North America during the 1940s. The reassessment was consistent. Guzenko's evidence had been accurate, the spy ring had been extensive, and the atomic espionage had been real and dangerous. His historical impact extended beyond the immediate arrests and convictions. The defection led directly to the creation of more sophisticated counterintelligence programs in Canada, the United States, and Britain. It changed how Western governments conducted security clearances and monitored foreign intelligence operations. It contributed to the climate of suspicion that defined the early Cold War, including the Red Scare and McCarthyism in the United States. And it established the precedent for how defectors would be handled, protected, and debriefed throughout the Cold War decades. The 109 documents he had smuggled out of the Soviet embassy in September 1945 had confirmed what intelligence analysts had suspected but could not prove. The Soviet Union, even while fighting alongside the West against Nazi Germany, had been systematically stealing Allied secrets, and one man's decision to risk everything had exposed that betrayal. The story of Igor Gouzenko is not a simple narrative about heroism and betrayal. It is a story about the impossible choices individuals face when caught between competing loyalties, about how one decision can expose critical threats while destroying personal lives, about how courage and sacrifice can coexist with regret and loss, about how the consequences of those choices ripple forward through generations in ways no one could have predicted. Igor Gouzenko walked out of the Soviet embassy on September 5, 1945, because he believed exposing the spy ring was his moral duty, and he lived the next 37 years in hiding because that duty required him to sacrifice his identity, his freedom, and any possibility of a normal life for his family. Both of those realities were true. Both were consequences of the same choice. And both were simultaneously acts of conscience and acts with devastating personal costs, depending on which angle you view them from.